I knew the company was finished the second our new CTO walked into the room and started talking like the laws of physics were optional. It wasn't the stock wobble, it wasn't the wellness initiative that replaced real coffee with chlorophyll mud. It was him, Cameron Holt, 29, venture capital pedigree, tailored vest, the kind of smile you wear when you've never had to be awake at 3:07 a.m. because production is bleeding money in real time. He stood at the head of the conference table like he'd been anointed, scanning a room full of engineers who looked like they'd been surviving on stress and stale bagels since the last outage. I sat in the corner with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, watching him appraise us the way a landlord looks at an old building he plans to renovate by removing the support beams. I'd been here 7 years. In startup time, that's a fossil record. I'm the one people call when the dashboards turn red and the execs start asking if we can just reboot the cloud. I built the core engine of our logistics platform during the 2021 supply chain chaos, when everyone else was playing panic-driven whack-a-mole and pretending it was strategy. That system kept our vendor compliance, purchase routing, and payment scheduling from collapsing under holiday traffic. It wasn't glamorous, it was just correct. Cameron clapped his hands once, crisp and performative. All right, team, I've reviewed the architecture. It's heavy, legacy heavy. We're pivoting to a microservices-first AI-assisted ecosystem by end of Q3.
A slide hit the screen. Circles, arrows, buzzwords. It looked like someone had tried to diagram confidence. My eyes narrowed because I could see what he was actually proposing. Deleting the central decision gate that enforced vendor compliance and shipment constraints. The legacy he wanted to sunset wasn't a leftover, it was the backbone. "Excuse me," I said, and my voice sounded rough because I hadn't spoken in a meeting in months. Heads turned. That legacy node handles most of our compliance enforcement and payment gating. If you remove it, you're not modernizing, you're amputating. Cameron turned toward me like I'd interrupted his podcast. His eyes flicked over my hoodie, the dark circles I didn't bother hiding, the fact that I looked like someone who solved problems instead of presenting them. Then he smiled, polite and empty. "And you are?" He asked it like a formality, but the contempt was real. He knew exactly who I was. I was the line item that refused to die. "I'm Owen," I said. "I wrote the core you're trying to rip out." He gave a soft laugh. "Owen, great. Look, what you built was fine back then, but we're not running a museum. Your monolith is holding us hostage. We need velocity." He leaned into the word like it was a weapon. Then he added, almost casually, "We're aligning staffing with the new vision. HR will handle the restructuring." Restructuring, the corporate word for we're about to remove the people who know where the breakers are. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I just checked the date on my phone and did the only math that mattered. My licensing agreement renewed in 5 days, and Cameron had no idea he was threatening the landlord while still living in the house.
The freeze-out didn't happen all at once. It never does. It crept in quietly, the way rot spreads behind drywall. First, I stopped getting calendar invites. The weekly architecture review vanished from my Outlook. Then the roadmap sync. Then the optional strategy sessions that somehow dictated everything. I sat at my desk 10 feet from the glass conference room, listening to laughter leak through the walls while Cameron held court at the whiteboard I used to own. Through the glass, I watched him erase diagrams I'd drawn years ago, actual logic flows that moved money without lighting anything on fire, and replace them with words like synergy, cloud-native mindset, and AI acceleration. None of it mapped to reality. None of it had error states. It was all aspiration dressed up as engineering. People I'd worked with for years stopped making eye contact. In corporate environments, getting fired is treated like an airborne illness. If you linger too close, management might decide you're symptomatic. By Tuesday, Cameron introduced a new hire. "Team, this is Lucas," he said brightly, "our product evangelist. He'll be spearheading the transition." Lucas looked barely old enough to rent a car. Clean sneakers, perfect haircut.
He walked up to my desk with a smoothie and a rehearsed smile. "You're Owen, right? Cameron says you're the legacy expert. I'd love to pick your brain before we deprecate the old stack." Historian. Deprecate. I turned my chair slowly. "Lucas, do you know what happens when our system fails a compliance check mid-transaction?" He blinked. AWS retries it?" I nodded. "Good luck."
He wandered off, confidence leaking out of him with every step. By Thursday, my access to staging was revoked. No explanation, just an automated email. Permissions updated by admin. I didn't fight it. I didn't escalate. I opened my personal laptop instead, the one that didn't belong to the company, and logged into the account for my LLC, Black Harbor Systems. The first of the month was approaching. The quarterly licensing fee for the core platform was due. Historically, the old CFO had it on autopay. He'd understood contracts. He'd also been restructured the previous quarter. I refreshed the account. No pending transaction. An hour later, still nothing. That's when the calm settled in. They thought because I sat in a cubicle and received a paycheck, technically a retainer processed as payroll for their convenience, that they owned me. And if they owned me, they owned the code. They were wrong on both counts. I pulled up the contract. Clause 3, non-payment constituted immediate breach, no cure period for willful default. Clause 5, unauthorized modification voided usage rights. Cameron had already violated that one. He just didn't know it yet. Friday afternoon arrived right on schedule, which is when companies prefer to dispose of people quietly. At 4:12 p.m., a calendar invite appeared on my screen. Subject, quick sync. Location, conference room C. I didn't need a translator. I started packing before the reminder pinged. There wasn't much to take. A screwdriver set I trusted more than most executives. A framed photo I kept face down. A plant that had survived 3 office moves in one merger. I wiped the company laptop properly, not because I had anything to hide, but because leaving sloppy data is how amateurs get sued. While the drive scrubbed, I checked the Black Harbor Systems account one more time. Still nothing. No wire, no pending payment. Midnight was less than 8 hours away. At 4:30 sharp, I walked into conference room C, a glass box positioned near the elevators so everyone could see who was being erased. Cameron was already there, arms crossed, vest immaculate, posture relaxed in the way of someone who thinks the outcome is inevitable. HR was represented by Natalie, a woman whose entire job seemed to be delivering bad news gently enough that no one screamed. "Have a seat, Owen," she said. I sat and placed a thin folder on the table. Cameron didn't acknowledge it. He launched straight in. "As we realign toward our new operating model, your role no longer fits the trajectory of the organization." Trajectory. He loved that word. "Effective today, we're terminating your employment." Natalie slid a packet toward me. 2 weeks severance, an NDA, a non-disparagement clause, the usual paper shield companies hide behind when they know they're wrong. I didn't touch it. I handed over my badge, then the laptop. Cameron smiled, already halfway to victory. "Security will escort you out." "We're done with the employment conversation," I said evenly. "Now we need to discuss the vendor relationship." He frowned. "What vendor relationship?" I opened the folder and turned it so they could read. "Licensing agreement. Signed. Renewed quarterly." "I don't work for you," I said. "I never really did. Black Harbor Systems licenses the core platform that runs your logistics, compliance, and payment routing."
"My presence here was on-site support." Cameron laughed and pushed the folder back. "That's ancient startup paperwork. Anything built here belongs to us." I tapped the highlighted paragraph. "Read it." His eyes skimmed, then slowed. I watched confusion try to override arrogance and fail. "You were on payroll," he snapped. "That voids this." "Administrative convenience," I replied. "IP rights never transferred." I stood. "You also missed a payment. That's a breach." Cameron's face hardened. Get out before I call security. Already on my way, I said, heading for the door. Check clause 6. I didn't look back when he started shouting. I walked past my desk without slowing, past Lucas hammering at a keyboard like effort could replace understanding, past the break room where the new coffee still tasted like regret. Outside, the air was heavy and wet, the kind that makes everything feel slower. I sat in my truck for a minute before starting it, letting the silence settle. They thought they'd fired an employee. What they'd actually done was remove the last person who had any incentive to keep their lights on. I drove home, stopped at a liquor store that didn't bother pretending to be upscale, and bought a bottle I hadn't touched in years. That night, I didn't do anything dramatic. No hacking, no sabotage. I logged into the Black Harbor Systems admin panel and checked the license status. Active. Grace period pending. Expiration in 48 hours. The system pinged my server the way it always had, asking permission to exist. I let it keep breathing. Saturday passed quietly.
My phone buzzed with automated alerts I ignored. On Sunday afternoon, the system started flagging failed checks. They were probing the core without the proper keys, trying to stitch new services onto something they didn't own. Each attempt logged itself neatly, time-stamped and archived. Evidence has a way of organizing itself if you let it. Sunday night, I slept better than I had in months. Monday morning arrived whether anyone was ready or not. At 7:58 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table with coffee that actually tasted like coffee and watched the clock roll over. The license check ran. Grace period expired. The system did exactly what it was designed to do when a tenant stopped paying rent. It shut itself down cleanly. No explosions, no theatrics, just a series of red indicators where green used to be. Inventory processing halted. Vendor authentication failed. Payment routing froze mid-cycle. The phone started ringing almost immediately. Unknown numbers, company lines. I let them pile up. At 8:11 a.m., a text came through from an old colleague. Everything's down. Cameron is losing it. I watched the dashboard cascade and felt nothing but distance. This wasn't revenge. It was enforcement. At 8:24, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. Cameron's voice was tight, stripped of confidence. "What did you do?" "Nothing," I said. "I stopped doing something." He shouted about lawsuits, about theft, about how I was going to regret this. I let him finish. "Check the contract," I said. "You're running unlicensed software." Silence followed, then panic bleeding through the cracks.
In the background, I could hear phones, shouting, the sound of a company realizing too late that the person they underestimated still held the keys. Cameron tried threats first, because that's all he knew. Lawsuits, criminal charges, ruining my reputation. I let him talk himself out. When he finally stopped to breathe, I spoke slowly, the way you do when explaining gravity to someone who just stepped off a roof. You terminated the support contract. You failed to pay the licensing fee. The software reverted to its default state, off. He swore and demanded I reverse it immediately. I told him I no longer had administrative access to their environment, which was true in the most literal sense. I didn't need it. The license server didn't care about his job title. It cared about compliance. He hung up. At 8:37 a.m., my phone rang again. Different voice, older, tired. This one introduced himself as Martin, interim CFO. He skipped the bluster and went straight to numbers. They were losing money by the minute. Orders stuck, warehouses idle, vendors unable to authenticate. I told him I was aware. He asked what it would take to restore service. "Payment," I said, "and a conversation." By 9 a.m., the CEO was on the line. Richard always sounded calm, even when everything was on fire. He tried the conciliatory tone, talked about misunderstandings, about Cameron being young, about how we were all on the same team. I told him teams pay their vendors. He offered my job back, a raise, stock. I declined. I wasn't interested in returning to a place that only remembered my value when the lights went out. He asked what I wanted. I told him there were two options,
Option 1, they migrate off my platform immediately and accept the losses. Option 2, they purchase a perpetual license for the source code and documentation. Full transfer, no support obligations, clean exit. He asked for a number. I gave him one. There was a long pause. He called it unreasonable. I called it cheaper than staying down another hour. Lawyers entered the call, then silence while they argued on mute. At 10:14 a.m., I received an email requesting wiring instructions. I sent them. At 10:27, the transfer hit my account. I confirmed receipt and updated the license status to perpetual. The system came back online as quietly as it had gone dark. Green indicators returned one by one. I didn't celebrate. I closed the dashboard and shut the laptop. By noon, it was over. They owned the code now, and I was free. The adrenaline didn't hit until everything was quiet again. Once the system stabilized and the frantic call stopped, the silence felt heavy, like the aftermath of a storm you watched from indoors. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the bank balance, not smiling, not shaking, just absorbing the reality that a chapter had closed permanently. I knew better than to confuse winning with relief. Winning just means the pressure moves somewhere else. By early afternoon, messages started coming in from people who hadn't spoken to me in months, former coworkers. A couple of senior engineers who suddenly remembered my number. None of them asked if I was okay. They asked what happened, whether the rumors were true, whether Cameron really lost control of the entire platform in one morning. I didn't answer. I had no interest in narrating my own execution report. By the end of the day, internal politics had already rewritten the story. Cameron hadn't been reckless, he'd been misinformed. The outage wasn't caused by breach of contract, it was an unexpected vendor dispute. Language exists to protect power, not truth. I took a walk that evening, something I hadn't done on a weekday in years. The city looked different when you weren't racing home to fix something invisible. People were sitting outside, eating, laughing, unaware that millions of dollars had frozen and unfrozen that morning because of a paragraph no one read. I realized something unsettling then. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would have been easier. Anger keeps you tethered. What I felt instead was distance. Cameron would survive this. People like him always do. He'd be reassigned, insulated, given a new title that meant nothing and protected him from consequences. The company would survive too, at least for now. They'd paid for stability, not understanding. That was the real cost. They owned the engine, but they'd lost the map. That night I boxed up the last reminders of that job, old notebooks, a badge that no longer opened anything. I didn't destroy them. I'm not sentimental, but I respect evidence. Before going to bed, I checked my messages one last time. There was one from an unfamiliar address. Short, direct. Heard you're available. We should talk. It was signed by a competitor's engineering director. I set the phone face down and turned off the light. I didn't need to decide anything yet. For the first time in years, nothing was on fire. I waited a full week before responding to anyone. Not because I was negotiating, but because I needed to recalibrate what leverage actually felt like when it wasn't theoretical. When you've spent years being the quiet fix in the background, it's easy to forget that scarcity has weight. By the following Monday, the message count had doubled. Recruiters, executives, consultants pretending not to be scouts. One name stood out because it didn't waste time. Northline Systems. Their director of engineering asked for a meeting. No pitch attached, no flattery, just a time and a place. I showed up in a jacket instead of a hoodie, not to play dress-up, but to remind myself that context matters. The lobby was bigger than my old office, colder too. They didn't do scrappy. They did scale. The director, a heavy-set man with careful eyes, got straight to it. Their compliance platform was failing under growth, slow, brittle, held together by vendors who charged by the apology. He'd heard I built something that didn't break when pressure spiked. I told him that was true. He asked if I could sell it to them. I told him I'd just sold it to their competitor. He nodded, unfazed. Then build it again, he said.
better. That was the first interesting thing anyone had said to me in months. We talked constraints instead of visions, failure modes instead of roadmaps. He didn't interrupt. He didn't say velocity once. When he asked how long it would take, I didn't lowball it. I told him the truth. He agreed without negotiating. We shook hands on terms that would have sounded fictional to me a year earlier. As I left, I checked my phone and saw the internal memo had leaked. Cameron had been reassigned to a special projects role, the kind that comes with a title and no authority. He hadn't been fired, of course he hadn't. Consequences are for people without insulation. I didn't feel vindicated, just unsurprised. That afternoon, I framed the old contract and hung it above my desk, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Systems don't fail because they're old. They fail because the people in charge stop respecting the parts they don't understand. I started sketching the new architecture that night. Clean, ruthless, built to survive executives. Building something new feels different when you're not doing it under threat. The first week at Northline wasn't about code, it was about boundaries. I asked for a small team, real engineers, not evangelists. I asked for veto power over architectural changes. I asked that no one override a technical decision because it, quote, played better in a deck. They agreed to all of it without blinking. That told me everything I needed to know about why they'd reached out in the first place. They weren't chasing buzzwords. They were bleeding quietly and wanted it to stop. I worked out of a temporary office with a whiteboard and no calendar invites I hadn't approved. The design came together faster than I expected. Not because it was rushed, but because I wasn't fighting gravity anymore. No legacy constraints, no politics baked into the stack, just clear rules. Fail fast, fail loud, never lie to downstream systems. I built it to assume people would misuse it. Systems last longer when you expect bad behavior. Meanwhile, news from my old company trickled in through back channels. The outage was being framed as a resolved incident. Cameron was still employed, technically, but no longer visible. Meetings he used to run were reassigned. Decisions bypassed him. He'd been neutralized without ceremony. That's how corporations punish embarrassment. They don't fire you, they shrink you until you're irrelevant. Northline's prototype went live in under 3 months. It didn't replace their old platform immediately. It shadowed it, took traffic silently, proved itself without asking permission. When the switch finally happened, no one noticed outside the engineering floor. That's the highest compliment a system can earn. One evening, while reviewing logs, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't checking dashboards with dread anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next emergency. The work was still hard, but it wasn't hostile. I slept. I ate meals without a laptop open. I stopped measuring my worth by uptime percentages. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that had paid millions to keep running had bought stability without understanding. The one that hired me afterward got understanding without having to lose a morning. Respect is cheaper than recovery. People just don't learn that until it's too late. By the time Northline's system reached full capacity, the market noticed. Quietly at first. A missed earnings call here, a delayed shipment there. My former company started slipping in places that didn't make headlines but absolutely mattered. Response times stretched, compliance checks slowed. Engineers became afraid to touch anything tied to the old core because no one fully understood it anymore. They owned the code, but they didn't own the confidence to change it. That's what happens when knowledge leaves before documentation ever mattered. I heard Cameron eventually stopped coming into the office. Officially, he was exploring strategic initiatives. Unofficially, he'd been sidelined so thoroughly that even his calendar was empty. Titles can't compensate for trust once it's gone. Northline didn't gloat. They didn't need to. Their system simply worked. Faster audits, cleaner vendor onboarding, fewer late-night incidents. Clients noticed. Contracts followed. I sat in review meetings where executives asked why things were going so smoothly, and for once, the answer was boring. Because the system was designed to tell the truth, because no one was allowed to override reality for optics.
I kept thinking about the moment Cameron dismissed the core as legacy garbage. He wasn't wrong about one thing. It was old. But old doesn't mean fragile. Old means tested. What he'd mistaken for inertia was actually restraint. You don't rip out load-bearing walls because a new blueprint looks exciting. You do it when you understand what's holding the building up. One afternoon, I received a forwarded article, buried in the trade news. Stock down, leadership restructuring, unexpected operational challenges. I read it once and closed it. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt closure. The narrative would never mention a missed payment or a contract ignored. It never does. Companies don't admit they lost because they underestimated someone they thought was replaceable. They just move on and hope no one asks the wrong questions. I went back to work. There was still code to write.
6 months after I walked out of that glass conference room, my life looked quieter from the outside. No emergencies, no late-night calls, no dashboards bleeding red at dawn. I worked reasonable hours and stopped explaining myself to people who didn't know the difference between speed and stability. Northline's platform became the standard by accident, not marketing. It spread because it didn't fail when pressure arrived. My former company still existed, technically. They had a system they were afraid to touch and a memory they refused to acknowledge. Cameron eventually disappeared into another role somewhere else. People like him always land softly. That stopped bothering me once I understood something simple. Winning wasn't humiliating him. Winning was never needing his approval again. I framed the old contract and hung it above my desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of a lesson most people learn too late. Power doesn't come from titles or confidence. It comes from owning what actually makes the machine run. The quiet engineers, the unglamorous systems, the clauses no one reads until it's too late. I still check logs sometimes, not out of fear, but out of habit. Watching clean data flow is calming. It reminds me that competence leaves a trace even after people try to erase it. I don't hate the company that fired me. Hate requires proximity. What I feel instead is distance in clarity. They thought they were cutting dead weight. What they did was cut the line that kept them grounded, and they paid for the privilege. I never raised my voice, I never argued, I just enforced the rules everyone agreed to and forgot. That's the thing about professional revenge. When done correctly, it doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like business.